right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are again for another episode of Hitting the Keynote, how to communicate complex subject matter to a wide audience. Special guest today, Brett King. Brett King joins us as a best-selling author of a book called Rise of Technosocialism. That's a loaded title, Brett, so we're going to get right into what that's all about. As usual, ladies and gentlemen, if you are looking at us live, I did not advertise this, but there might be a few in my LinkedIn or YouTube. You are welcome to jump in with comments. You are welcome to jump in with challenges. We want this to be an open form conversation, so please, by all means, do that. For those of you listening about a month later to the archive of the podcast when I drop it, welcome to the show, and find us on podcast.hittingthekeynote.com or follow me on LinkedIn is probably the best one. Easy to find because I've got an unusual name, Edwin-Eddie Doyle Manhattan. Just type that into LinkedIn. I'm the only bloke that turns up. All right, fantastic. Brett, thank you for joining us, man. I'm so happy to have you.
No, thanks for having me. Appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, fantastic. So let's get into the title of your book. Let's start there. So I'm going to keep drawing us back to the skill and art of communication. I'm fully convinced that we will solve the world's problems if we can communicate what's truly in our heart, because I make an assumption that the majority of human beings, albeit there were a bunch of primates and it's a miracle that we're not ripping each other's eyeballs out every day, the majority of people are wonderful people. And we want the same thing, which is to say a little bit of peace and quiet, a little bit of warmth on our face, a little bit of love, some food in our belly, and to be living a peaceful life. And yet there's a lot of contention. So let's start with, your book, The Rise of Technosocialism, and how you chose to communicate the complex subject matters in that book. Tell us what they are to the public.
Good point. I mean, obviously, the title itself is a bit contentious, but that's part of a marketing strategy, I guess, in terms of getting people to sit up and take attention to it. We start the book out with a very simple statement. We're not going to be debating political socialism and classic socialism, but we'll say that the biggest impediment to the word socialism from a policy perspective is who's going to pay for it. So if I can demonstrate to you that we can deliver the benefits of socialism at a fraction of the cost of the existing system we have, then it's worth having the conversation. And so that's how we start the book out. But ultimately it revolves around sort of 3 or 4 core issues and 2 very clear sort of trends at a macro level. The issues are growing inequality. We can see that obviously through the pandemic, how that has worsened. The rise of artificial intelligence and how that's going to change the way society works, and specifically in respect to employment and economics. And lastly, the impact of climate change and how that's going to impact society at large. And so when we look at those 2 things, the levers that we have in terms of organizing principles for society is that we can use technology to deliver big government at a very small price with a very small footprint, because we're building it based on automation. And secondly, that issues like artificial intelligence and climate change require a collective response. It needs to be something that we agree on broadly in terms of, again, organizing principles around society. You can't have a national climate change policy, not when you're going to have 521 cities inundated by sea level rise by 2050. That's already baked into the existing estimates. And so, 300 million to 1 billion climate eco-refugees, you can't say, hey, we've got a national climate change policy and we're good. Let's forget about all these other global issues. You must think more collectively. So in the second half of this century in particular, you're going to see the philosophy of humanity, the purpose of humanity, much more collectively oriented than individually oriented, which has sort of been the trend during the 20th century.
Okay, wow, there's a lot to unpack there. That's fantastic. Thank you. Let's start with artificial intelligence. So I want to start with what I think is the most complex subject matter. Do you think that's what it is? You mentioned environment, artificial intelligence.
Sure.
What was the first thing you mentioned?
So we talk about inequality,
Okay.
Is sort of the first thing.
Which is the most complicated out of all those subjects?
Well, so Inequality is the most impactful right now to individuals. The US has the worst inequality since the founding fathers formed the nation today. And so, that in the US alone, it's a pretty critical issue. But the US is not alone in this respect. But the disparity between rich and poor is clear. The billionaires of the world accumulated $10 trillion of new wealth during the pandemic, and 150 people that were previously been taken out of 150 million people that had previously been taken out of extreme poverty reverted back to extreme poverty during the pandemic. The US went from 500,000 homeless to over 2 million homeless during the pandemic. And so, inequality is sort of the core issue at society right now. But AI is an issue we can't wait until it impacts society to deal with, because half of the jobs that we have in developed economies today will likely disappear as a result of automation. So by the time we feel the effects of artificial intelligence, it will largely be too late, because that will have contributed to inequality more significantly. And the outcomes history tells us of this level of inequality are typically revolution. And so, we have to deal with this systemically, or else it's going to just get worse.
So how do we communicate the complex idea of the artificial intelligence replacing certain jobs, which is going to happen over the next 50 years, to those people whose jobs are being replaced? What I think we need to say to them, and it's probably not those people today, actually, it's the ones going into school today that will end up in that track of job. What are we saying to them to say, hey, number one, wake up. You don't want to be walking down this road because robots going to do this. And number two, how are we communicating to guide them into something else? Okay, so that's what I'm going to challenge you with in a moment. But let me set something up as a little bit of a contrarian, not maybe even a little bit, probably a steep contrarian view, which is that, I don't know how to put this. This is why it's about hitting the keynote, right? About how to use the vocabulary effectively. Because no matter how I say this, I'm going to sound like a real jackass. Okay, this is what's going to happen
cool.
right now, and there's going to be commentary about it. But what I want to try and say is something along the lines of, let's say, taxi drivers and truck drivers. That's going to be automated. Absolutely. It seems obvious that it's automated. I want it to be automated. I think it will be safer being automated.
Absolutely.
I think that the amount of jobs created through automating those roles will be greater than the loss of jobs in those roles. And to the truck drivers, and this is where I'll get a lot of condemnation from the social justice warriors, I say, have greater aspiration than being a truck driver. Okay, now that hurts a bit, but that's my commentary.
Sure.
Number one, how do I say that? Not as you and I debating, and we should certainly do that too if we do disagree. I want to do that and model how to debate in a respectful manner, because we don't see that from our politicians these days. But how do I communicate that more effectively? It's like, have better job aspirations. It's pretty damn insulting.
Yeah. Well, it's unfortunately, that's largely the perception, that more jobs will be created by automation than those lost. But the data really is doesn't really support that view. So that's a key problem we have to deal with. Is it going to create more jobs or destroy jobs? And so, you might use the internet.com as an analogy to show, well, for every job that the internet took, 1.6 new jobs were created, according to data from McKinsey back in the dot-com boom. Right? However, the shift to AI is more like us moving away from agriculture prior to the Industrial Revolution and moving to factories and production line and the sorts of jobs created by the Industrial Revolution. It's a change in the way we work. And for all of us, we'll be working less hours. The 40-hour working week is traditionally an anomaly in human existence. We never had that until the Industrial Revolution. And so the real question is, how's the nature of work going to change in respect to this? Well, there are certainly opportunities for huge growth in employment in the future. Climate mitigation, for example, will be the largest employer by the mid-2030s of any industry on the planet. But right now, we're underinvesting in that space. So what do I say to people like truck drivers and so forth? Here's what I'm going to propose. AI is going to create incredible wealth, but also incredible disruption. That wealth it creates will be enough for us to support strategies like universal basic income, which we will need to do with the very high levels of employment that happen quite quickly. The market will not create those jobs. The reason being is the market rewards companies that perform in terms of profit creation, and they do that through destruction of jobs by the use of technology. The market is not incentivized to create jobs for taxi drivers that lose their job because of automation. We have to come up with a private free market approach to that. Ultimately, this displacement will happen quite quickly, and we'll need to plan our approach to that. And so societies that just let the free market go with this and sort of see where it ends up will have a higher level of displacement of people and disruption than those who sort of sit down and say, we need a policy and a plan for these people displaced by technology. Job training programs, development of new industries that are going to employ those people, and perhaps taxing robots or algorithms such that they support job creation for those jobs that are lost through the imposition of technology. But the good news is that once we get through that era of AI, it will create enormous wealth. It will allow us to provide sort of basic social infrastructure for people at a fraction of the cost of what we think of it today. But at the heart of it, it's about the fact that the 21st century economy is fundamentally different from the 20th century. And at the heart of that, it means we have to be educating our children very differently. We have to educate them to work with artificial intelligence. We have to educate them to understand where humans differentiate from robots. Let's face it, right now today, there are students, half of the students going through finance degrees, accounting degrees, and legal degrees in university. By the time they graduate, their intended jobs will already be affected by artificial intelligence. And so we have to fix this at the grassroots by changing the way we educate and skill the labor force. And we're not doing that. And so that already tells us that the impact is going to be worse than it could potentially be had we thought about this a little bit earlier.
So here's an observation for the audience as far as, the theme of hitting the keynote. Brett, you are very confident in your knowledge. So, you must have been studying this for, I would say, at least 10,000 hours. There's that whole Malcolm Gladwell, 10,000 hours, right?
Sure.
Book of that tipping point, I think. So you've been on this journey for 10 years? Yeah,
I would say, it probably extends a little longer than that. People identify me as a futurist. And so, as a futurist, you're always thinking 5, 10, 20, 30, 50 years out in terms of how something that you see developing will impact our future. And so when you get into that frame of thinking, you're always thinking about the systemic outcomes here. But that's system thinking, the philosophy of what is the purpose of an economy, as an example. That's something where I've had to do a ton of research, reading philosophy, looking at economic theory and so forth, going back 300 years. And so to be a good futurist, you have to look at the past. You have to look at how human behavior works and so forth. And that's the only way you can sort of get that sort of clear-mindedness around it.
Okay, so this is really important to understand the way you're thinking, because this will help people with the way they communicate. You're very articulate, very clear, confident in what you're saying. And so this is the art of communication. But in actual fact, you didn't do that in order to communicate well. I think communicating well is the byproduct of, 10, 15, 20 years into the future. And then what are you doing with that past knowledge? Are you trying to look for patterns of disruptions that happened in the past that look like they might happen here? And probably the socioeconomic impact is going to be the same. Yeah, it's new technology. It's really cool. It's not horse and wagon moving to the Ford car anymore. What we're doing is we're moving from the regular car to the artificially driven car, right? So is that tell us about what's going on in your mind as far as correlating patterns and how this is able to help you communicate.
Well, that's very good. Obviously, we can use those different analogies. In my last book, which was called Bank 4.0, Banking Everywhere, Never at a Bank, focused on the fintech space, I looked at first principles engineering. as a core design premise. And so if you look at the most disruptive innovations throughout history, you mentioned the automobile, which was actually invented by Daimler and Benz, and then Ford invented the production line facility around it. Or you look at the smartphone, the iPhone. Steve Jobs and Johnny Ive didn't take the most popular mobile phones of the time and iterate on that. They started from scratch with a fundamentally new design. The same has happened with SpaceX recently in the United States. And that's why SpaceX has lowered the cost of getting a kilogram of mass into orbit by 98% from the days of the space shuttle through first principles engineering. So when we see first principles engineering impact on a specific industry, we know that over the space of 10 to 20 years, that industry is going to be completely disrupted, and the traditional players are going to become far less relevant because the new entrant changes the rules. And so that's one pattern, for example, we can see occurring over and over again in terms of technologies.
And you said it's first principles engineering, is that what you
Correct.
said?
First principles design.
What does that mean?
So Elon Musk has a great way of sort of defining this. He says you break the problem down to its constituent physics, and then you redesign the solution based on the newer technologies that are available today. So if you think about the iPhone, a couple of key technologies were critical to that: multi-touch display, the way they built this into a handheld frame, the App Store, all of those things were part of the iPhone's success. But right. Key was that multi-touch display technology. That was not available 10 years before, nor was the computing power to produce a device that could store 10,000 songs and do your email and internet and so forth in that device. So, but if they had iterated on the Motorola StarTAC or the Nokia Banana phone or the BlackBerry with a RIM keyboard, the iPhone would have looked very different than it does today. Right. The fact that they used first principles engineering and it was so successful means that every smartphone in the world effectively now has to model itself off the iPhone. And so that was the impact of that first principles design thinking, starting from scratch, not iterating on an older model. And so when you have big change, like you said, the horse and cart going to the automobile, that was a systemic change. Now we had to think about driver licensing, roads, how we get fuel into the motor vehicles. In the early days, the regulators looked down on the technology of the automobile. In fact, if you're in New York City or London at the time, you had to employ someone to walk ahead of you in the early days with a red flag. We called these the red flag laws because we didn't want the automobile scaring the horses, right? Wow. And so that was how we responded initially. It was a threat to the existing system. But the technology, that first principles design was just too compelling. And that's why it eventually, within 20 years, the whole personal transportation industry had changed.
So in first principle design, what you're doing is you're looking at, as a futurist and a great communicator, you're looking at history, and then, like Elon Musk says, you're breaking down whatever the concept is, and then saying, okay, to solve whatever that problem was in the past that got created, the Model T Ford, in today's environment, how would I actually put a car together? That's what Elon Musk did and created Tesla, which is the smartest car on the planet, right? Makes all other vehicles sound and look dumb and feel dumb, right? So you're doing that in communication. Let's take then, okay, let's see if I can vocalize this well, right? So as far as your point of artificial intelligence not creating more jobs than what I was saying a little earlier, it would make sense to me, and I just don't know the statistics, so I can't fact check myself at the time, but you probably got the facts in your head here, that when the automobile was created, the horse and buggy drivers, of course, said, hey, this is going to put us out of a job. But at the end of the day, all the people involved in the production of a car would be far more than a horse and buggy driver. And my second point as to why I would think that progress in artificial intelligence is a good thing for everybody, like all boats rise with the tide,
absolutely,
is simply that's progress, right? You can't, if we didn't progress back then, would still be horse and buggies, right? So it's kind of like too bad, so sad, horse and buggy driver or current day taxi driver. this is progress, and you just don't want to get steamrolled by progress, right? It's not a matter of the state looking after you. As a libertarian, right? It's definitely not a matter of the state looking after you. It's a matter of you standing up on your own 2 feet and saying, I guess I won't be a taxi driver. I guess I'll have to do something else.
Okay, so then that comes back to, let's look at the economy.
Okay.
Let's look at first principles design at the economic level.
Okay, yeah. All right.
So let's break it down to the constitute physics. What's the purpose of the economy? Is the purpose of the economy to create economic growth for the nation, or is it to make happy and healthy citizens?
Happy and healthy citizens.
Right. And if that is the case, we're not doing that right now, because inequality shows as a measure that it's not being effective. So then the question becomes,
right,
how do we make the economy more effective for more citizens? And that's when you get into a conversation. Is it the responsibility of the taxi driver to go out and get himself a new job? Or is it the responsibility of the system to change the education and the way we educate people and provide skills transfer programs to ensure that they can do that?
I say it's definitely both. And I say that because there are taxi drivers who just don't want to be educated, couldn't care less. So I don't see why the system should carry that person. There's not many of them.
So that's a good question that we ask. And what is the largest basis of that argument in terms of the system shouldn't carry them? Most of the time it's people saying, I don't want to have to be the one that bears the systemic costs of that person who doesn't participate in the new economy. Right? It's the cost basis, right?
That's right. But there's an additional point there, which is that if somebody doesn't want to be helped, it's a waste of time. So it's not just that, like, the middle class will complain, we carry the country, and the middle class pretty much does from a tax perspective. The super rich pay a voluntary tax, donations to opera houses. The super poor don't pay tax. It's the middle class. So those are the ones that complain about carrying the economy, and they do. But it's more than just carrying the economy. It's the fact that it's a waste of economy and a waste of money on people that, let's say, wouldn't want to be educated. But I also want to tweak the idea. My understanding of the economy is to give an individual the opportunity to progress. So in other words, a free trading marketplace where I can go to an employer and I can say, I think I'm worth this much. And the employer says, I think you're worth this much, right?
Yeah.
To negotiate what that worth is, and then in order to work in a fair and competitive environment according to a meritocracy. Whereas I don't think it's the function of an economy to necessarily provide an equal, certainly not an equal outcome. And equal opportunity is even a very strange word, because we are born with different IQs, and we're born.
Well, let me actually sort of again, systemic thinking, going back through history.
Okay.
Let's look at the most successful economies of all time.
All right. Which are
and
what?
So if you look at the single most successful economy throughout history in terms of wealth creation through a certain period, it's the post-Second World War US economy. Right?
Yeah,
It was massively successful. I don't think anyone will agree with that. At one point in time, the US accounted for fully a half of all production output in the world, and incredible wealth generation. But the difference between the post-Second World economy and the economy in the US today is that in terms of income distribution, the US had a very, traditional bell curve in terms of distribution of wealth. We had a very strong growing middle class, and that occurred because of a number of programs that happened post-Second World War, including infrastructure investment, the national highway system. Those job creation programs after the Second World War is what created middle class growth. That led to middle class consumption, housing booms, electronic booms, and so forth, really fired the economy. We see the same happening in China today. The middle class is growing, consumption is growing, and that's fueling the Chinese economy, where the Chinese economy will overtake the US economy as the largest economy by 2026 or 2027, right?
No kidding. Okay.
Now, when we look at what happened in the US in the 1980s, further to your point, is in the late 1970s and 1980s, in the Reagan administration, in the Thatcher administration in the UK, there was an attack on collective bargaining and trade unions because it was seen as uncompetitive, carrying these costs where employees had this power. And then during the Clinton administration, there was the deregulation of financial services. Right. So William Durant describes, the economy of the post-Second World War US as a diamond-shaped economy, an economy with an even distribution, a growing middle class, solid consumption that creates broad economic activity and economic growth. But for 98% of human history, we haven't had a diamond-shaped economy. We've had feudal systems, which are pyramid-shaped economies. Right. And so the policies put in place in the 1970s and 1980s in the United States and Britain flattened the diamond back to a pyramid shape where more wealth was accumulated.
Sorry, I want you to keep going with that, but I'm not quite understanding the bottom of the diamond. What was the bottom of the diamond?
So what you get is as you get a even distribution of wealth, the poor are less poor, the rich are less rich, and you get a growing middle class and you get growing economic activity across the broad economy. When you flatten that out and you increase the disparity between the rich and the poor, what happens is you lose half of the economic activity you would during a diamond-shaped economy. That's why it's pyramid-shaped and not diamond, because you're cutting off the supply of input into the bottom of the middle class, the low to middle income, families and so forth for consumption, right? And so that's really what's happening now. And China went from a pyramid to a diamond shaped, and that's why China's economy is growing faster than anyone else right now. So we know throughout history that's the best models, but the problem with the system is that the wealthy have strong ability to input into policy discussions. They, and set the agenda, and that's the key problem. But if we look at it systemically in that way, how do we get the US back to a diamond-shaped economy? Right. It's investing in infrastructure, 21st century infrastructure that's going to create jobs, investing in climate mitigation. For example, energy. Let's look at energy production in the United States. We know now today fossil fuels are 1/6 of the price of coal in terms of generating a kilowatt of electricity. So the obvious question is, why don't we change the entire grid to be renewables based, given that commercially it's far cheaper than the traditional ways we've generated electricity? Well, the problem there is storage, right?
You said fossil fuels is cheaper than coal. Not, did you mean to say renewables is cheaper than coal?
Sorry, yes, you're right.
Okay, so
renewables dramatically cheaper than fossil.
Really, right? And there's enough renewables to give us the same power as fossil fuels?
By 2030, the entire world could be powered only by renewable energy if we committed to that goal as a society. But it would require massive infrastructure investment. It would require us putting battery storage and energy storage plants all around the place. We'd have to change from a centrally generated electrical system to a distributed energy system. So we know what we would have to do. So then the question is, given that it would be so much cheaper to generate electricity with renewables, and that coal is never going to be cheaper than renewables ever again, why haven't we committed to that? Well, that comes down to some inertia in the existing system, some vested interests, and those sort of things. But you want to create 3 million jobs immediately in the United States, that would be one way to do it. In fact, it's probably more than that, right?
I tell you what, Brett, this is amazing because, again, as a libertarian, I tend to go, government, just get out of it, go over there, right? And then what I see from the renewables energy sort of marketing is Greta Thunberg. And I must admit, I think the renewable energy movement does themselves a disservice by holding Greta up as a sort of, this is our queen. It tends to rub people the wrong way. I'm not sure why. It would be interesting to figure that out. But as far as hitting the keynote, you're hitting the keynote here, because as a libertarian, I listen to this and think, well, isn't that interesting? If indeed it's true that the renewable power will give us just as much as fossil fuels, we'd be foolish from an environmental perspective not to do it. I think it's dumb to cut off our lifeline to health, oxygen, right, and staying alive in order for us to have toast. So awesome if that technology is there, and then it will create jobs and give us that diamond. So again, hitting the keynote, you've just given us a visual. That's a big part of communication, right? Just doing this and this is going to stick with me and with the audience. So that's awesome. So how would you advise then? Like I was at the Windsor Energy Group. All right, so this is a group of old oil and gas guys, right? Granted, we're at Windsor Castle, which is not a good look, right? If you're staying at Windsor Castle and you're an oil and gas person, you're bound to have bad press. So I was invited as a speaker, specific actually to cybersecurity.
Great gig though,
on
like
oil and gas.
in terms of
What's that?
Great gig in terms of location.
That was a great gig.
Yeah.
It was a tiny little room, though. Those royals don't live that well. And I'm an anti-royalist, believe me. I love being in America, and I think we should just liquidate the royal family's assets and put them all to work. Side note. But when you're at a gig like that, you're bound to get bad press. It's just, oh, you're a bunch of old boys, right? You know, they just want to poison the planet so they can get rich, and we're hanging out at Windsor Castle of all places. So, you know, not a good perspective. But certainly, that industry uses financial clout to put pressure on legislation so that they can continue doing what they're doing. And as a libertarian, I completely disagree with that, right? Business should not be involved in politics. It's like, get the hell out of there. These lobby groups are a misrepresentation of what democracy wants. So the problem, however, and at that group there was one or two, you know, would be called tree huggers, right? We were giving a really hard time because they were waving the Greta Thunberg flag, and I don't know, why aren't more people talking like you, right? How can we help that side talk like you do so that I'll actually listen and not roll my eyes when they show me a child? Right?
Yeah. Well, you know, I've not met a single renewable person that uses Greta Thunberg as a spokesperson. So, you know, I mean, maybe that's different for me. But again, you know, when you watch the mainstream media, again, who's funded by fossil fuel companies, you may definitely get that impression. I think, you know, there are some really good people like Ramez Nam, for example, who leads the energy practice at Singularity University out on the West Coast. You can follow him at Ramez on Twitter, and Ramez has been talking about this for many years, particularly the levelized cost of energy, which is the measure that the Energy Institute for the nation uses as the primary measure of costs, and how we look at that. We also see that, you know, China, for example, you know, because always the argument comes back is, why are you talking about this in the US? Why isn't China and India doing their part? Yeah. You know, China, for example, deployed more solar between the years of 2017 and 2018 than the US has in its entire history. And you know, so they're obviously starting to retool their economy already, but they're doing that because it makes sense economically, right? And so the real question is, if we were to let this go, if we were just to let capitalism sort of try and work this out, would we get there? Well, the answer to that is probably pretty clear, is that, you know, we could have developed these renewable technologies far more aggressively back in the 1970s and 1980s, and we could have been carbon neutral and before the turn of the 21st century. Why didn't we? Well, we were making really good money on the market out of fossil fuel companies and their investments. And so that's sort of the perverse incentive of capitalism right now, is that companies can dictate certain policies and so forth because of their position in the market and the way they can influence policy. Yeah. But we need to sort of step back from that and saying, what's the purpose of the economy? Should we have a technology like fossil fuel burning? Forget climate change, you know, because there's some people that may still debate, you know, anthropomorphic, you know, the Anthropocene era, you know, human involvement in this. But let's just take pollution. You know, more than 100 100,000 people die annually in the United States due to respiratory disease created by pollution. And so you think about that in terms of the whole debate around coronavirus and flu, and we're like, well, why do we allow pollutants in the air that kill our citizens? So it comes back to the core purpose of the economy again. Is how should the forces within the economy economically be aligned? And first and foremost, the position I think should be that the economy should do no harm to its citizens. It should provide for a basic level of care if we can afford to do that. We're the richest economies the world has ever seen, and we have enough resources to make sure everyone is housed and fed and accommodated and their health taken care of. And then on top of that, we have commercialism and capitalism that can generate further growth for the economy. But that sort of would be a natural structure if you are serious about humanity first and the planet first, and that the economy should serve that purpose first and foremost. If not, then we're really organized economically to serve corporation and those who benefit from the wealth that is generated by corporations as a first measure. And so that's the real conundrum, philosophical question. Right. What's the optimal organization of humans in an economic or national setting?
I want to come to the defense of the word capitalism for a moment in a sort of a Milton Friedman kind of a way, where you see, so here's my proposition. I don't think it's capitalism that is at fault in the 70s and 80s when we should have switched more heavily into renewables like China did last year. I think it's actually the fault of government, because pure capitalism would say, free market, hey, I've got you a choice, and this is in the 1970s, a choice between dirty fossil fuels that are polluting the planet and your children, and lead and fuel and cancer and there, right? And amazing job opportunities and growth with this renewable thing. We've been doing this oil thing for 100 years, time to say goodbye. I've got a new opportunity. Capitalism, I think, would actually let that renewable energy just fly. I think the problem is actually government, the government interference, the fact that we said capitalists, but it's really CEOs of corporations that just want to line their pockets. That's not necessarily capitalism. Capitalism is innovation. These are people that are lobbying and legislating so that they can crush renewable energy. There was that documentary years ago, Who Killed the Electric Car? It was a good documentary.
Sure.
There's a little bit of BS in it, but it was a good documentary. The trouble I had...
Well, the first vehicles ever manufactured were electric vehicles, not Tesla. Gasoline vehicles. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, exactly. It was the Tesla. It was the AC versus DC with Tesla versus
yes,
light bulb guy.
Edison.
Yeah, Edison. That's right. And so I think that capitalism gets a bad rap because of lobbyists. Well, that's corruption. That's not capital. I like to say people get their schemes mixed up. Communism,
I don't want to descend into a political debate because this is not really about politics. It's about philosophy, right? But the problem with capitalism is the incentives, and the incentives are set by shareholders, right? That where profit is generated. And so if you're a fossil fuel company generating huge amounts of profit, like Exxon and so forth were in the 80s and 90s, what's the imperative for capitalism to say, let's invest those profits in renewables instead of returns to shareholders? That's the core lever problem. And so when you look at reform of capitalism for the 21st century, we need more levers than quarterly returns and net profits and dividends, right? So we need new levers that measure companies. Are they sustainable? Are they carbon neutral? Do they replace every job that they destroy with technology? Do they offer a path to replacement of that job, through job programs or something else, right? Because in a purely free market sense, markets are going to go, hey, you know what? These technology companies are employing 1/100th of the people they used to employ. That means more profit to us. Isn't that fantastic? And so that would, that can't be, the sole measure of the effectiveness of capitalism and corporations operating under that model. And so that's the key problem. I don't think it's lobbying is, again, incentivized because of those perverse incentives. They get the opportunity to do that because they don't get called called to attention on it. The shareholders aren't going to say, "Hey, whoa, hang on, why are you messing with policy?" Because they don't say that because we made great money on the shares on Exxon the last 5 years, right?
And I think they also stay in their swim lane. I mean, look, if indeed, and I think it's true that renewable energy is going to create tons of new jobs, etc., it would be in Exxon's best interest to pursue that path. There's something else that stops them from doing it, right?
But when we see innovation occur throughout the world, this is one of the things, is that, look at the effect Tesla motor vehicles has had on the automobile industry.
Right.
And GM and Ford and Toyota and all of those companies fought them tooth and nail.
That's right. It's bizarre. Right? I know.
Because
following.
Because that's your business model. You've committed to internal combustion engines. You've built your entire production facilities around that. You've built your entire marketing around performance of the combustion engine. Pivoting on that requires the fact that a competitor is taking your lunch, right? And so the incentives to change business don't occur until someone comes along and disrupts your business model. And so that's why Exxon and those companies didn't voluntarily make that switch to renewables back in the 70s and 80s.
And they tried to crush it, which is a real shame. That is unforgivable. Do you know another great communicator, a bloke called Simon Sinek, wrote that book?
I know Simon, he's great. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant communicator. So he brought on the lesson, and it was baffling to me when he first used the example that MP3 players weren't invented by Apple, right?
Yeah.
He said Dell had one of the first MP3 players, but the way they communicated it, and this is the whole start with why and his eccentric circles, was, we got this kick-ass, MP3 player, and it has blah, blah gigs, and it's this blah, blah, speed and storage, and, we're a computer company. Whereas Steve Jobs said, 1,000 songs in your pocket.
Pretty simple, right? And Kodak invented the first digital camera, right? But it was going to disrupt their film business. Right. So they chose not to go down that path.
The keypad, right? Xerox came up with that pad, didn't know to turn it into what Steve Jobs turned it into. So that brings on a great thing. So we've got about 10, 15 minutes left. So one of the things I love to ask my guests is, how do you distill everything down into a sort of a meme? And I'm not a fan of memes and tweets. It's a terrible way to communicate, but we're in this world where if you can't grab somebody's attention in 30 seconds, you're done. So what we have to do, whether it's the environment, whether it's capitalism versus socialism, whatever it might be, we need a killer sentence. Now, the favorite one I have that I got from this hippie in Canada, I went camping with my kids and wife many years ago. We stayed on this bloke's land. And so he set up his land like, they're orchards, and there were orchards of peach trees. This is in British Columbia, in internal British Columbia. I'm a Canadian citizen.
Sounds wonderful.
And so we went to camp there, and it was amazing because it was all, homegrown vegetables. Help yourself to my vegetable garden. One of these guys lived off the land. This guy was off the grid, right? Had his own water, had his own renewable energy. It was a totally cool experience. Now, he came into our little, where we were staying, he had these little sort of cabin teepee things. And of course, compared to him, we were a bunch of big city people. So I had a box of cereal, and he looked at this and he just went after me. It was kind of funny because he said, look, man, food doesn't grow in a cardboard box. And that was 10 years ago. I still remember it. Because if you want to encapsulate the complexity of the plethora of diets, just go to a bookstore. There's an entire section on food and dieting and eating healthy. Keto, right? Carnivore, vegetarian, vegan. It's like, my goodness. And then you get all the vegan warriors and all the carnivore warriors battling. And it's like, there's so much to know. And yet, America and the Western world is getting more and more obese. And here's the irony. We're actually buying more vegetables than we ever did. Right? Because we know this through statistics. So there's a problem. And the problem can, frankly, the majority of the problem can be solved by saying food doesn't grow in a cardboard box. The actual problem is just artificial garbage that people are eating. Whether you eat a piece of steak or a vegetable, if it comes from the ground or eats the ground, it's food. So I like to say to my kids and their friends and everybody I meet, food doesn't grow in a cardboard box. If you're eating from something that came from a box, it's not food. That's it. That's the one rule. And if you obey that one rule, in 6 months, you'll be as healthy as bloody lion, right? So Let's come up with a sentence to close out today's conversation that's just like that. Food doesn't grow in a cardboard box. So representing, let's say, the benefit of technosocialism for the environment. I think that's probably a big one, right? What can we say in one meme, one tweet, one killer sentence where people are like, oh, okay, I'm really going to remember that. This is going to help them with communicating your ideas, these ideas we discussed, to their friends. All right, let's come up with something on the fly. It's always a great challenge, but memes rule.
Yeah, I would probably look to Aristotle and say that humanity is at its optimal when we work together for the purpose of thriving humanity.
Humanity is at its optimal when we work together for the purpose of
thriving humanity. So the problem we've got right now is we compete against each other. We compete against each other in economics. We compete against each other across national boundaries. That conflict is inefficient. Right now, you might say, and it's largely arbitrary or abstract, right? Michael Collins just died today. 4 days ago when he tweeted about Earth Day, he tweeted about the fact that if we looked at the Earth from outer space, we'd recognize there weren't any national boundaries. We're one family together, and we do our best when we work as a species together on that. And that would be the same for the planet and for our health and all of those things. If we competed for each other instead of against each other, then we'd have a far more optimal outcome for every human than the current system we have.
What do we do then with competition? Because without competition, I don't...
Oh, and I'm not saying you don't have competition.
Right, because I need that. I need to be...
No. I'm saying you compete for the purpose of furthering humanity. So when it comes to, say, renewables, one of the things we're going to have to do over the next 20 years is sequester carbon out of the atmosphere to start gradually lowering the temperature, the mean temperature again over time. And so that technology, Elon Musk recently announced he's going to put $100 million into an X Prize for this. But that's the sort of thing I think we can do. Let's compete to create this incredible technology that, and there are commercial opportunities for that, obviously, but ultimately we're competing to further humanity. When it comes to the food in a box, when we look at supply chain of food and farming and things like that, is it going to be more efficient to grow meat in a lab than on a farm with cattle, if it has exactly the same properties? Should we have vertical farms in, greened cities, urban greening programs, because it reduces supply chain? We don't have to have the lettuce travel from the Midwest to New York or LA anymore. We can grow it in vertical farms within the city. There's some things that we can sort of practically do, but it comes back to competing for humanity rather than competing against each other.
Brett King, that's fantastic. Aristotle, I love it, right? As a libertarian, obviously, I love Aristotle because he's the guy, the rational thinking guy. So
Philosopher King, Socrates and Plato as well, absolutely.
Give us that quote one more time.
The optimal form of humanity for the future of the species is that we can all thrive together by working together. That's another way to phrase it.
Yeah, the optimal condition for humanity is that we would all compete together to work together for the optimal good of society.
Because if we can push the advancement of humanity as a species, then that should flow on to everybody, rather than it be captured just. And it doesn't say capitalism has to disappear. Capitalism just needs to be reformed. That's all.
100%, man. That's really cool. Brett, where can people find you on the socials? Which is the best way to get hold of you?
They search me Brett King. They'll find me. I come up #1 in most searches. You can go to brettking.com for my website, at Brett King on Twitter, and find me there. Beautiful, beautiful.
Man, I'm very grateful for this conversation. It was a beautiful dialogue, and I think that is the point of hitting the keynote, that it's beautiful.
Right, can I make one last comment?
Go on then.
So when I became a keynote speaker on the circuit, I've been doing this for like 13, 14 years. It was only about 4 to 5 years into it that I actually realized that the true art in being a good communicator was storytelling.
Storytelling.
because that's how our brains work, sitting around the campfire. So if you want to take one skill away that I've learned as a speaker, it's storytelling.
Tell a good story. Point people in the right direction. Where should they go to learn how to tell a good story?
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, just look at the best keynote delivery guys in the world: Malcolm Gladwell, Gary Vee, etc.
Right.
And you'll see they all tell stories.
You're talking about Gary Vaynerchuk?
Yeah,
exactly. All right, Brett, really good of you to pay it forward to those guys. You are right. Storytelling is where it's at. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Tune in again, and we will help you pitch your keynote and be the hitter of your keynote. Take care. Bye-bye.